Hey, this is DJ Mortal, and welcome to Buildcrafting 101, or as it's probably better described, Buildcrafting for Dummies. Now, I've no doubt you will have seen hundreds and hundreds of videos out on the web that say, this is the best build ever, this slays in end content, and it probably does. However, none of these videos ever go into the fundamentals of buildcrafting, so how do you know how to make these builds for yourself? Or are you just completely reliant on somebody else's opinion, or a build that may not suit your playstyle? So this series of videos is designed to give you that background information and base understanding to go get the armor that you need and create your own customized and optimized build that maximizes your Guardian's abilities, synergizes your weapons, mods, fragments, aspects, subclasses to suit your specific playstyle and what you're actually trying to achieve in game, whether it be to beat high level content such as Grandmasters, Master Raids, solo dungeons, etc., or if you want to go into the Crucible and be an absolute god. So in this first video we're going to talk about stats, what they actually mean, what the tiers mean, what wasted stats are, and more importantly, and the real reason we're here, what do mobility, resilience, recovery, discipline, intellect and strength actually do in game? What is the benefit from moving from one tier to another, and where do you want them to be? So let's jump right in and talk about mobility. Now, mobility has three main components, those being movement speed, strafing speed and crouched movement speed. And unlike all the other stats we're going to talk about, mobility has a linear progression throughout all of its tiers. Now what this means is, each increase in stat tier gives the same improvement over the previous one. So, movement speed, at tier 0 your Guardian will move at 5 meters per second. And that increases by 0.2 meters per second for every tier from 0 all the way up to tier 10, where you'll be moving at 7 meters per second. Strafing speed, or lateral movement, i.e. side to side, starts at 4.25 meters per second at tier 0 and increases by 0.17 meters per second for every tier up to tier 10, where you will move at 5.95 meters per second. Your crouch speed increases by 0.11 meters per second per tier, from 2.75 meters per second at tier 0 up to 3.85 meters per second at tier 10. So if we look at this on a graph, we can see that it's a straight line from tier 0 up to tier 10 on all three components of mobility. This is what I was meaning when I said it's a linear progression. Mobility also governs the recharge rate of the Hunter class ability, be it the Acrobat's Dodge, Gambler's Dodge or Marksman's Dodge. Unfortunately, you no longer have access to the times in-game for the respective tiers, so I've had to apply the previous progressions to the current base stats, and they do seem to be pretty close to what I'm observing in-game. However, disclaimer, these times are worked out by mathematics rather than actual hard data in-game. However, with that said, we do see a pretty linear progression with regards to decreasing times for recharge rates for all three dodges. Slight deviations within the chart are down to rounding. So to surmise, mobility is probably a secondary consideration for builds on Warlocks and Titans, but of utmost importance for any build utilising a Hunter where you'll be using your dodge ability in combination with other mods, which we will cover later. Moving on to resilience, the resilience stat directly influences the amount of damage your Guardian can absorb before being defeated. Now this makes it a significant factor in both PvP and PvE. So a higher resilience stat actually has three benefits. One, a higher resilience stat increases your base health pool from 185 HP at tier 0 up to 200 HP at tier 10. Now, while this doesn't sound like a huge increase, it can make all the difference in staying alive. Unlike mobility, there is an acceleration in benefit from 1 HP per tier to 2 HP per tier above tier 5. In other words, tier 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 go up by 1 HP each. Tier 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 each increase by 2. Looking at this on a graph, you can see a clear acceleration above tier 5. Now, my personal preference is never to go into any high-level PvE activity with less than 70 resilience, and I generally aim to be at 100. Now, resilience not only affects the health pool, but also reduces incoming flinch and the damage taken from all sources, i.e. enemy attacks, environmental hazard, damage over time, etc. Flinch is reduced by 1% per tier, and this is all the way through the tiers, i.e. a tier 8 Guardian will receive 8% less flinch than a tier 0 Guardian. Damage resistance accelerates through the tiers, receiving additional benefits of 2% at tier 1 up to 30% at tier 10. And if we look on the graph, you can see that there is an acceleration curve. Now, there is some slight deviations from a straight bell curve here, but this is purely because of the number rounding that's used in-game. Resilience also governs the Titan class ability recharge rate, i.e. your barricades. Now, like the Hunter dodge mentioned earlier, unfortunately the in-game UI no longer tells you the cooldown times at any given tier, only the base rate. So again, I've had to apply the progression from previous seasons where this was known. So as mentioned with the Hunter, these times have to be taken as an approximation rather than hard fact. That said, like before with the Hunter, you can see a pretty steady decrease in recharge times as the tier increases. Put simply, higher resilience means better survivability and an improvement in flinch resistance. Higher tiers, better results. The recovery stat governs the rate at which your Guardian's health and shield starts to regenerate after taking damage. Higher recovery means that your Guardian will recover from injury and shield damage far faster, reducing downtime between engagements and keeping you in the fight longer. The recovery stat in particular is really highly valued by many PvP players because of the reduced downtime between engagements and overall in survivability. Guardian with tier 0 recovery will take 9 seconds to fully regain their health. Each subsequent tier will improve this time by 0.2 seconds up to tier 6, where there is an increase in the benefit to 0.4 of a second, up until tier 9, and tier 10 has a 0.06 improvement in recovery time. This equates to tier 10 taking 6 seconds to fully regain your health. Looking on the chart, you can see the acceleration mentioned from tier 6 to tier 10. And for this reason, I would never recommend any build, for PvE in particular, to be below tier 6 recovery. In PvP, I would always recommend to be higher than tier 8, ideally tier 10. Like mobility to Hunters and resilience to Titans, recovery is the stat that governs the Warlock class ability recharge times. Like the Hunter and Titan class abilities before, the Warlock class ability shows a pretty steady decrease in times for both Rift and Phoenix Dive as you progress to the higher tiers. There's no particular tier that offers a significant improvement over any others. So we've reached the midpoint in the video, and if you found this information useful so far, please consider dropping a like and maybe even a subscribe. You really would be doing me a favour. Anyway, back to the stats. The next 3 stats can become very confusing very quickly. The reason being, discipline, intellect and strength all have differing effects on different ability types, and the community generally refers to these types of ability by putting them into tiers. Now, as we're talking about tier with regards to individual stats, i.e. recovery, discipline, intellect, etc., I'm going to refer to these instead of tiers as levels. This is just to avoid any confusion when I'm speaking about particular types of ability as opposed to tiers in stats. Okay, so with that said, let's move on to the discipline and the individual types of grenades. Now remember, all grenades are available to all Guardian classes, so none of this is specific to one class over another. Level 1 grenades are Axiom Bolt, Flux Grenade, Glacier Grenade, Lightning, Shackle, Solar, Threadling, Void Wall and Vortex. These have the highest cooldown times of all grenades. In level 2, there is the Cold Snap, Skip, Storm, Suppressor, Thermite, Trip Mine and Void Spike grenades. Level 3 includes Arc, Bolt, Incendiary, Magnetic and Scatter grenades. Level 4 includes Duskfield, Flashbang, Healing and Swarm grenades. Level 5 is only the Grapple grenade. Level 6 only the Fusion grenade. And level 7 only the Firebolt grenade. Now at this point it's worth calling out that the base cooldown times equate to tier 3 discipline. What this means is any tier lower than 3 will actually give you a penalty in the recharge rate of your grenades. Now unlike the class abilities that were mentioned earlier, all of the times listed in this table are hard data taken directly from the current season's UI. So the 152 second cooldown, or 2 minutes 32, shown at tier 3 for a level 1 grenade is 100% accurate. Looking at the chart that shows all grenade levels, you can see there's pretty hefty penalties as you go below tier 3. However, from tier 3 to tier 10, there is a pretty steady decrease per tier, and no individual tier gives an acceleration in the decrease in recharge times. Now, obviously that chart is rather busy due to the number of grenades that are involved. So if we strip this down purely to a percentage improvement in recharge times, you can see that a tier 10 discipline will reduce the base cooldown of any grenade by 50%. So, in summary, you never want to have your discipline stat below tier 3, or you will be heavily penalised on your cooldown times. That said, the actual level to aim for is going to be entirely dependent on what your build is focusing on. If you are using your grenade as your primary offensive ability, you will want to be at least tier 7, preferably higher. Most of my offensive builds that focus on grenades will be tier 10. The Intellect stat affects the cooldown of your Guardian's super ability. A higher Intellect stat means that your super will recharge faster, allowing you to use it more frequently in combat. In a similar way to Discipline, with Intellect, not all supers are equal. They are grouped into 4 levels, with the more offensive super abilities such as Golden Gun, Fists of Havoc, Daybreak, etc. being in level 1, and the more support style supers such as Ward of Dawn and Well of Radiance being level 4. Level 1 obviously has the longest recharge time. Like Discipline before, tier 3 Intellect is your base cooldown. Having an Intellect tier lower than this will incur a heavy penalty to your recharge times. If we look at the charts, we can see clear penalties lower than tier 3. Between tier 3 and tier 7 we have a steady improvement in recharge times before diminishing returns between tier 7 and tier 10. For this reason, I would only ever recommend aiming for tier 7 on Intellect unless you are specifically building into using your super as an offensive tool. If we look purely at the percentage improvements in recharge times, this diminishing return above level 7 becomes very apparent. The strength stat governs the cooldown reduction of your Guardian's melee ability. A higher strength stat leads to faster melee ability recharges, allowing you to make more frequent close quarters attacks. In the same manner as grenade and super abilities, melee abilities are grouped into levels, again based on their offensive ability. That said, level 1 have the highest cooldown time and level 7 have the shortest. However, not all classes have abilities in every level. For example, the only level 1 melee ability is the Hunter weighted throwing knife, and the only level 7 melee ability is the Hunter combination blow. This actually seems quite strange considering how potent combination blow can be if placed into a build correctly. Just as we mentioned before with discipline and intellect, strength tier 3 equates to your base cooldown that is stated in the game UI, and lower tiers will increase the cooldown times of your abilities significantly. Looking at the charts, we can see a steady improvement from tier 3 up to tier 10, with no one tier in particular given an increased improvement in recharge rates. If we look at recharge times as a percentage of base cooldown time, you can see that tier 10 offers a 50% reduction in recharge time over tier 3. However, as previously mentioned, there is no particular point that gives an increased or decreased benefit over any other. Therefore, as with discipline, I would recommend to never go below tier 3 in a build. However, beyond that point, it is entirely dependent on what your build is focusing on. A melee based build would want a significantly higher strength stat than a build focused on grenades. Now, before I go, I just briefly want to touch on wasted stats. Now, this is something I'm going to cover in more detail in a future video, however I feel it worth mentioning here. Now, throughout this video I've been talking about tiers 0 through 10 with regards to stats. However, in game the stats actually run 0 through 100. Now, each tier corresponds to 10 stat points within any given ability. So 10 discipline is equivalent to tier 1. 80 discipline is equivalent to tier 8. The important thing to remember here is you do not increase in tier until you pass over that next 10. In other words, a discipline stat of 59 will give the exact same benefit as a discipline stat of 50, meaning those 9 points above 50 are wasted stats. They are not doing you any benefit whatsoever within your build. Let's look at one of my Warlock builds as an example. This is my Getaway Artist build, and you can see I have 4 wasted stats, as I have 52 mobility, 71 resilience, and 81 discipline. So those 4 stats are not actually benefiting me. However, if I now change one of my armor pieces to just a random piece I happen to have on me, I now have 26 wasted stats. So with proper balancing of your armor, mods, aspects, fragments, etc., those 26 points could have equated to 2 additional tiers if placed properly. More tiers means improved regeneration of my abilities, better mobility, recovery, wherever I choose to place them. Okay, let's have a quick recap of everything we've gone through. So, mobility affects the movement, strafing and crouch speeds of your Guardian. All tiers give equal increases to the component elements. There is no sweet spot in the tiers. Mobility should be a high priority for Hunters, however it is a lower priority for Titans and Warlocks. Resilience affects base HP and reduces incoming damage and flinch. You get increasing returns from higher tiers. In PvE, you should aim for 70 as a minimum, however 100 is desirable. In PvP, it is secondary to recovery, but always aim for a minimum of 50 if possible. And finally, resilience is high priority for Titans. Recovery affects the time taken to regain health and shields following damage. It offers increasing returns above tier 6. In PvE, it is secondary to resilience, however you should always aim for 60 plus if possible. In PvP, you want a minimum of 80, however 100 is desirable. Recovery is high priority for Warlocks. Discipline affects the time taken to regain your grenade. All grenades are available to all classes, and grenade cooldowns are based on tier 3 minimum. There is no sweet spot in the tier progression, and the priority of discipline is determined by your build's requirements. Intellect affects the time taken to regain your super. Offensive supers have the longest cooldown times, and super cooldowns are based on tier 3. There is a sweet spot at tier 7, and the priority of intellect is determined by your build's requirements. Strength affects the time taken to regain your charged melee. Higher power melees have the longest cooldowns, and melee cooldowns are based on tier 3. There is no sweet spot in the tier progression, and priority is determined by your build's requirements. Wasted stats. So abilities only benefit from stat increases every 10 points. For example, 47 recovery has the same effect as 40 recovery. So you should always try to minimize wasted stats on your build. If you have 20 wasted stats, that means you've lost 2 potential tiers worth of stat points. But we'll have more details on this in a future video. For now, we're just going to leave it there, and I'm going to say thank you very much for your time. If you found this information useful, again, I really would appreciate a like and subscribe. You would be doing me a huge favour. And until next time, have a fantastic day.